From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
They are creating all kinds of excuses, whether it's the terrible murder of journalists or the humanitarian crisis of the Yazidis or whatever they can, to get the American people to say yes to another crazy war.
The U.S. strikes Syria. The military launches dozens of airstrikes on the Islamic State as well as on a separate al-Qaeda-linked group. Meanwhile, the U.S. expands its bombing of Iraq. We'll speak with Code Pink's Medea Benjamin and Professor Vijay Prashad. Then to the streets of New York, where 100 climate activists were arrested after staging a mass sit-in as part of an action dubbed Flood Wall Street.
Wall Street invests in all the polluting, wasteful, toxic, destructive, and extractive industries that are causing this crisis. Wall Street itself profits from the destruction of this planet and its human and natural resources. So we have to stop them, basically. And we've got to stop them from interfering with the politics of democracy.
And as the UN Climate Summit opens in New York, we speak with Indigenous leader Winona LaDuke, South African climate campaigner Desmond Desai, and Indian environmental activist Vandana Shiva.
The madness of the growth economy is chopping down every tree, damming every river, mining every mineral that can be mined, and calling it development. In our parts of the world, the word development becomes the ultimate justification for any destruction.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States has launched strikes against Islamic State militants in Syria. According to the Pentagon, the United States fired 47 Tomahawk missiles from warships as well as airstrikes from fighters, bombers, and drones. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, at least 20 Islamic State fighters were killed in strikes that hit at least 50 targets in Raqqa and Deir al-Zor provinces in Syria's east. U.S. Central Command said Bahrain, Jordan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates had either participated in or supported the strikes against the Islamic State. The United States also acted alone against a separate militant organization known as the Khorasan Group, saying it was taking action to disrupt, quote, the imminent attack plotting against the United States and Western interests. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said the strikes west of Aleppo killed 50 fighters as well as 8 civilians, including 3 children. The Syrian government said the United States had informed it of the pending attacks hours before the strikes began. We'll have more on Syria after headlines. The strikes in Syria begin after 6 weeks of U.S. airstrikes that failed to significantly alter the landscape in Iraq, where the Islamic State has claimed vast swaths of territory. On Monday, reports emerged dozens and potentially hundreds of Iraqi soldiers have been killed after militants overran a base north of Fallujah. An Iraqi lawmaker told the New York Times more than 300 soldiers died after the loss of Camp Saklawiya. Meanwhile, the Islamic State has released a second propaganda video featuring British freelance journalist John Cantley, in which Cantley warns U.S. efforts in Iraq and Syria could become another Vietnam. The French government has confirmed one of its citizens is being held hostage in Algeria by a group that claims ties to the Islamic State. The group Soldiers of the Caliphate has threatened to kill 55-year-old Hervé Gordel unless France stops bombing Islamic State positions in Iraq. France launched the airstrikes on Friday. French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius vowed the kidnapping would not change France's involvement in the U.S.-led offensive.
Everything is being done in close cooperation with the Algerian authorities to obtain the release of our compatriot, but we must not hide the fact that the situation is extremely critical. France's attitude remains the same. We intend to do the maximum needed to free the hostages, and more specifically, this hostage. But one terrorist group cannot influence France's position.
Here in New York, one day after the largest climate march in history, thousands marched on Wall Street Monday to highlight the role of corporations and capitalism in fueling climate change. At a protest dubbed Flood Wall Street, people sat down in the streets just blocks from the stock exchange. They remained for more than 8 hours until the police deployed tear gas and began arresting more than 100 people. The action came ahead of today's United Nations Climate Summit, where leaders from 25 nations will discuss an international agreement to cap record emissions of greenhouse gases. We'll have more on the protest in today's summit later in the broadcast. The heirs of Standard Oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller have formally announced plans to purge their $860 million foundation of fossil fuel investments. At a news conference Monday, Stephen Heinz of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund explained why Rockefeller's heirs were moved to join the growing movement to divest.
The diversity of the people who are involved in this, from every sector, from every walk of life, communities of just extraordinary diversity all across the country, tells me that this is getting to be more mainstream, which is very, very exciting. And the other thing is that it's clear that there's a moral imperative here, but there's also an economic opportunity embedded in this, which gives people something positive to do.
New data paints a much bleaker picture of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. On Monday, World Health Organization predicted without urgent improvements, there will be more than 20,000 cases of Ebola by early November, with thousands of deaths per week. Ebola is at risk of taking root and becoming endemic in West Africa. World Health Organization Strategy Director Christopher Dye said Ebola is nowhere near under control.
One of the key messages that we want to get across is that we are now in the third explosive phase of growth of the epidemic. This is exponential increase, with hundreds going into thousands of cases per week. And if we don't stop the epidemic very soon, this is going to turn from a disaster into a catastrophe. The
WHO's official death toll has topped 2,800 with about 6,000 total cases, but that's likely a vast underestimate. A New York Times reporter who visited a cemetery in Freetown, the capital of Sierra Leone, reported 110 Ebola victims have been buried there in just over a week. By contrast, since the outbreak began, the country's health ministry has confirmed just 10 cases for the entire city and its suburbs. Sierra Leone recently imposed a lockdown and house-to-house searches, recording at least 130 new Ebola cases and 39 suspected cases. Shiite Houthi rebels have seized new ground in the Yemeni capital Sana'a a day after signing a truce with the government. Sunday's deal with the rebels calls for Yemen to form a new government following weeks of unrest. According to the Associated Press, 340 people have been killed in fighting over the past week alone. On Monday, the rebels captured the home of a top general as well as military bases and tanks. Israeli forces say they've killed 2 people suspected of kidnapping and killing 3 Israeli teenagers in the West Bank in June. The teens' disappearance prompted an Israeli raid in the West Bank and its ensuing assault on Gaza, which killed more than 2,100 Palestinians, most of them civilian. Israel originally blamed Hamas for the kidnappings, but later acknowledged Hamas leaders played no role. Today, the Israeli military said it killed the 2 suspects in an exchange of fire in Hebron. The Obama administration's unveiled new rules to combat corporate tax inversions, where companies move overseas to dodge U.S. taxes. Companies like Burger King, Medtronic, and the drug maker AbbVie have announced plans to relocate after buying foreign firms. Critics say the rules announced Monday by Treasury Secretary Jack Lew are not enough to end the practice without involvement from Congress. And the Obama administration's increasing the U.S. nuclear arsenal despite President Obama's public championing of disarmament. When Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2008, the Nobel Committee cited his steps toward reducing nuclear stocks around the world. But the New York Times reports Obama's overseeing extensive rebuilding of nuclear weapons at home, including at a new plant in Kansas City dedicated last month, which is larger than the Pentagon and employs thousands of people. According to a recent federal study, the U.S. is poised to spend up to $1.1 trillion over the next 3 decades on modernizing nuclear weapons. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Aaron Matte. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. The U.S. has launched airstrikes in Syria, targeting militants from the Islamic State, as well as members of a separate group known as the Khorasan Group. The Pentagon says the U.S. fired 47 Tomahawk land attack missiles launched from warships in the Red Sea and North Arabian Gulf. In addition, U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps fighters, bombers, and drones took part in the airstrikes. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says at least 20 Islamic State fighters were killed in strikes that hit at least 50 targets in Raqqa and Deir el-Zor provinces in Syria's east. U.S. Central Command says Bahrain, Jordan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates had either taken part or supported the strikes against the Islamic State, which has seized swaths of Syria and Iraq.
Meanwhile, the United States acted alone against Khorasan. In a statement, U.S. Central Command said, quote, the United States also took action to disrupt the imminent attack plotting against the United States and Western interests conducted by a network of seasoned al-Qaeda veterans. The Syrian government said the United States had informed it of the pending attacks hours before the strikes began. The strikes west of Aleppo reportedly killed 50 fighters as well as 8 civilians, including 3 children. Meanwhile, the United States has expanded its air war in Iraq by launching airstrikes in the Kirkuk region of Iraq. In a separate development, Israel shot down a Syrian fighter jet, accusing it of infiltrating into Israeli airspace. It's the first such incident in at least a quarter of a century. To talk more about the U.S.-led strikes in Syria, we're joined by 2 guests. Vijay Prashad, professor of international studies at Trinity College, and Medea Benjamin is with us from Washington, D.C., just back from the flood Wall Street protests in New York. She's co-founder of Code Pink. Professor Vijay Prashad, talk about the significance of the U.S. striking Syria and the other Arab countries supporting it, though it's not exactly clear what role they played.
Well, it's very significant that the United States has struck in Syria. Since August, there have been about 200 strikes in Iraq. But the United States had been reticent to come into the Syrian theater. So this is a very significant development. It's also significant that there was an announcement that there was a coalition of countries, largely Gulf Arab states, but also Jordan. And Jordan was the first one to admit publicly that they were involved in some way in these strikes. It's also, I think, important to recognize that these strikes don't really have any kind of international backing. There's no UN resolution, nor is there any congressional approval. On the other hand, it does seem as if there was some coordination with the Assad government in Damascus, not only because the government in Damascus very quickly released a statement saying that there was a message sent to their ambassador in New York City about these strikes, but also you might recall that General Martin Dempsey, when he appeared before Congress, had talked about what he called the formidable air defense systems of Syria. And the fact that no air defense system from Syria had engaged any of the American planes or drones is indicative that there was some kind of coordination. So this is a very significant development. The dust is not settled yet, so it's extremely hard to know what the impact is going to be in terms of the complicated politics on the ground.
And Vijay, you have contacts inside Syria. What are you hearing so far about the scale of these strikes?
Well, it's important to know that the first person to reveal the strikes was Abdul Qadir Hariri, who's a young activist inside Raqqa. He revealed the strikes half an hour before the United States had talked about them. And Abdul Qadir, from the beginning, has been saying that these strikes are of an unbelievable intensity. You know, you have to imagine that somebody who's lived in Raqqa over the course of the last 3 years, as it's been in the midst of this very bloody and difficult war, immediately knew that the scale of this attack was far greater than anything he had experienced previously. And within seconds, he knew that the nature of the bombing could not be from the Assad government, could not be a war between the rebel groups, but it certainly had to be an American bombing. That means the scale must have been quite intense. They also say that in Raqqa, the targets that were struck, for instance, the painted black building which ISIS had claimed as their headquarters, had all been emptied, and that most of the ISIS leadership has moved into residential areas. So that's one of the reasons why there was a very low death count in the major strikes on Raqqa. But a great deal of infrastructure in Raqqa city was destroyed, and also on Tabqa Air Base, which had been taken by ISIS just a month ago when they overran it and threw out the Syrian government forces.
And Professor Prashad, this group called Khorasan and its leader Muhsin al-Fadli, can you explain what it is? It is what the U.S. is citing as the imminent threat to the United States, which would justify these attacks.
Well, it's true that Muhsin al-Fadli is quite a dangerous man. He's in his early 30s. He's a Kuwaiti national who, like many of the core leadership of Al-Qaeda, finds himself at all the important places at the correct time. He was in Afghanistan, he was in Yemen, he was in Chechnya. He was also the spokesperson for a small period of time of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was the founder of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Mr. al-Fadli was also in Iran for a little time, and it's interesting that this group is called the Khorasan group. Khorasan is a region in the northwest of Iran and bordering into Afghanistan. So apparently this group, which I'd heard about a few months ago, had based itself near Aleppo and had come into Syria to draw fighters from the Islamic State that they could use in operations abroad. The word also came that there were some people from Yemen who had joined them. But Amy, it's very important to understand that this is all very shadowy. The intelligence on this is very vague. It's certainly the case that there are people like Mr. al-Fadli inside Syria, but it's not clear exactly what the strikes in Aleppo targeted. They also hit Jabhat al-Nusra positions, which is the official al-Qaeda group inside Syria. So things are still very unclear, but nonetheless, there has been a strike purportedly on the Khorasan training facilities west of Aleppo.
And the context here of the Syrian civil war, are any of the groups, either the Assad regime or the other rebel forces who are opposed to Assad but also to ISIS, are either of them in position to take advantage of any strikes against ISIS by the U.S.?
Well, it's interesting, Aaron, that if you consider that the United States government has decided to strike in Syria, currently there is a siege of a major city called Kobane, which is on the Turkish border, where 500,000 people have taken refuge. Tens of thousands of people from Kobane have crossed into Turkey, and these are Kurds, so it's quite something that Kurdish refugees have been allowed into Turkey. This city is on the verge of falling. The ISIS fighters that have surrounded it are using heavy artillery that they stole in Mosul. So it's very striking that the United States didn't actually, attack their forward hardened positions, instead took out symbolic targets inside Raqqa. So I'm not sure that this is actually going to change the situation on the ground in northern Syria directly. This seemed like a major attack against ISIS as a demonstration of American strength. If America was truly trying to change the balance of forces in northern Syria, it would have struck some of these forward positions of ISIS that are laying siege at this point against Kobane.
I want to bring in Medea Benjamin, the co-founder of Code Pink. Medea, you've just come from the massive protests this weekend. Sunday, the People's Climate March. Yesterday, Flood Wall Street. You're back in Washington, D.C. You've been protesting any suggestion there would be U.S. strikes. Well, now they're happening on Syria. Your response?
Well, isn't it sad, Amy, that the day that the world should be coming together to say, how do we address the climate chaos that can really destroy our entire planet, instead the eyes will now be on the U.S. bombing campaign in Syria. And let's remember that the climate crisis the U.S. is so responsible for. So let's think about the timing of it. Also thinking about the timing is that the U.S. and the Obama administration is doing a George Bush. It's saying now we are coming together to say there's a fait accompli, and that's the bombing, and you are either with us or against us. Look at the coalition it brought together among the most repressive governments in the Middle East. Bahrain, that's been repressing its nonviolent democratic uprising. The Saudis, who provide the financing and the recruits for so many of the extremists. This is the diplomatic success of John Kerry. Instead of coming to the UN to say that we have the world coming together to stop the recruiting and the financing and the buying of the oil that ISIS has, we have the accomplishment of having repressive Arab regimes joining us in bombing another Arab state.
What are the links, Medea, you've seen between war and climate change?
Well, we have been talking during this weekend about how oil is the basis of U.S. policy in the Middle East. Were it not for Iraq's oil, the U.S. would have never invaded, would not be there to begin with. The military is the largest polluter. The oil companies are being protected by the U.S. military strength. We see the military-industrial oil complex all together in this. And I think it's so sad that when the world is crying out for solutions, both solutions to the climate crisis and nonviolent political solutions to the issue of extremists, what the Obama administration is giving us is a support for the oil monarchies, support for U.S. oil companies, and continued perpetual war.
Medea, what would be a nonviolent political solution to the issue of the Islamic State?
Well, the Obama administration is supposed to have been working for a binding resolution that we should be hearing about by the Security Council, talking about cutting off the funding, cutting off the equipping of these extremist groups. That's a positive thing. At the same time, the Obama administration has only given 1 week to the new government in Iraq to show that it is no longer a sectarian Shiite government that is suppressing Sunnis, but is actually going to be a government for all the people of Iraq. 1 week is certainly not enough to show that and to have the Sunnis peel away from ISIS. That takes time. There is no imminent threat to the United States right now. That is a lie. What the U.S. did is do this timing right at the time of the UN to have it be already an accomplished deal that they better get in with on us with this or not. So I think the political solutions have been put aside now for the military ones.
Medea, this Khorasan group and its leader, Muhsin al-Fadli, who the Times writes in a piece from Saturday saying, according to the State Department, was so close to bin Laden, he was among a small group of people who knew about the September 11, 2001 attacks before they were launched. They're saying the imminent threat is that they know that they're focused on the West and some kinds of explosives that they want to use, not clear suicide jackets or what it is that they're talking about. Do you see this as a pretext to sort of fulfill the requirement for, quote, imminent threat for an attack like this?
The U.S. has been searching for a justification for this attack. First, it was to protect U.S. personnel inside Iraq. Then it was humanitarian. And now it's an imminent threat of a new group that it was only Thursday that was being talked about. Our intelligence agencies have been saying that there is no imminent threat to the United States. So this is yet another justification. And indeed, if there is an imminent threat, the job of our government is to protect us here at home. By going overseas and bombing, we become more of a target of extremist groups.
Medea, you were organizing protest groups a year ago to pressure Congress to vote against the United States striking Syria. That's Bashar al-Assad's government. Now we hear that the U.S. government, at the very least, notified the Syrian government that they were going to attack in Syria, and clearly the Syrian government did not strike them even as they attacked. What about this shift of U.S. alliances right now?
Well, it is totally unclear, as Vijay was saying, what the U.S. is doing. There are some reports that by targeting Khorasan, the U.S. will actually be strengthening other extremist groups because they're fighting internally with each other. There is absolutely no end game to this. In fact, the end game we see is one like Libya, where it is a total failed state that is spreading extremism throughout the Middle East. So there is no well-thought-out policy here. There is only a military mindset that is counterproductive, will lead to more extremism, the U.S. becoming more of a target. It's totally wrong. And your audience, Amy, people who care about the future of this planet should be getting out on the streets, calling their congresspeople, saying this was never discussed in the United States. There was never a vote by Congress to go to war. This is against the international law. You can't bomb another country country without a justification for it, which hasn't been given. And so we have to get out and oppose this.
And Vijay Prashad, these strikes in Syria coming after 6 weeks of U.S. bombings inside of Iraq. Can you talk about what is happening there and the effect of these attacks on ISIS inside Iraq?
Well, ISIS inside Iraq, as you saw from September onward, moved much of their heavy machinery into Syria. I mean, that's been their strategy. Is they're not going to wait around for the bombing. You know, in the same way in Raqqa, they had abandoned much of the central part of the city. And so what the United States bombed in Raqqa were largely empty buildings. You know, they have been moving their heavy machinery around, their arms around. They are currently, as I said, attacking in northern Syria. So where the strikes happened were not exactly where their main fighting forces are right now based. What's striking to me is that given that the UN is meeting this week, given that President Obama is going to actually chair the Security Council, it's surprising that the United States hasn't taken this opportunity to lean much more heavily on close US allies, in fact, NATO member Turkey. You know, Turkey had said that it wouldn't close its border, wouldn't actually come in to help find other means to isolate ISIS, because it had hostages that ISIS was holding. Turkish hostages were being held in Iraq. Those hostages have been released. This would have been a perfect time to have leaned on Turkey to strengthen the border, cut off the ability of ISIS to draw on the outside world. But instead of doing any of these political things, the United States has gone in to bomb largely empty buildings in northern Syria.
And the significance, Professor Prashad, of the British Prime Minister Cameron meeting with the president of Iran, Rouhani, here in New York. That is his plan. The first time a British Prime Minister would meet with an Iranian leader since the Iranian Revolution. And the reports Sunday that the Saudi foreign minister met with his Iranian counterpart, Mohammad Javad Zarif, in New York, according to the Iranian news agency.
Frankly, I think that the real solution in the region is going to come from some kind of grand bargain between Iran and Saudi Arabia. These two countries have been at each other's throats since 1979. They have opened the region to the entry of outside forces. You know, when these two countries decide that it is in their absolute self-interest to have some kind of grand bargain, we're going to see a de-escalation in the region. So any kind of meeting of this sort is greatly welcomed. I would hope that the forces of peace would encourage more meetings with the Iranians, more meetings between the Iranians and the Saudis. If that doesn't happen, this is just Band-Aid, this is just a lot of loud noise, but it's not going to provide the kind of political solution needed in the region for the long term.
I want to thank you both for being with us. Vijay Prashad, Professor of International Studies at Trinity College, author of a number of books, including The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South, and Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink, her new book, Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control. Also interesting to note the networks hardly discussing the issue of climate today after the largest mass climate protest in history, but focusing on these strikes and the people they're bringing into the network studios, very often those who got it wrong in 2003, 2002 in the preparations for the war in Iraq, who alleged weapons of mass destruction. Seeing people like Medea Benjamin on their networks is very rare. The peace activists who at that time got it right. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Mate. We'll be back covering flooding Wall Street in a moment.
We're gonna rise like the water. We're gonna calm this crisis down. I hear the voice of my great-granddaughter singing, shut down Wall Street now. The people gonna rise like the water. We're gonna calm this crisis down. I hear the voice of my great-granddaughter saying, shut down Wall Street now. The people gonna rise like the water. We're gonna calm this crisis down. I hear the voice of my great-granddaughter saying, shut down Wall Street now. The people gonna rise like the water.
Canary Project, 48 flood. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Maté.
One day after the largest climate march in history, protesters marched near Wall Street Monday to highlight its role in fueling climate change. The action comes one day ahead of today's UN one-day climate summit, when leaders from 125 countries will take part in the first high-level climate talks since Copenhagen nearly 5 years ago.
Monday's protest was dubbed Flood Wall Street and saw hundreds dressed in blue hold a sit-in on Broadway just blocks from the stock exchange. There were thousands around them. They stayed in the street for more than 8 hours until police used tear gas to break up the gathering, began arresting more than 100 people. Among those taken away in handcuffs was a person wearing a polar bear suit. Well, Aaron Maté and I were in the street Monday talking to those involved with flooding Wall Street.
I'm David Zolmet. I'm at Flood Wall Street. We're with thousands of people who marched 300,000 strong yesterday. And because the world leaders meeting in New York tomorrow are listening to corporations and not people, we're taking it to where the power is, and thousands of us are about to sit down. We're right next to the bull on Wall Street because corporate capitalism always is hardwired to create climate change. So we need a new system. We have the solutions.
My name, Yat A. Shea Dana Elder Genishia, Tajikin initially, the Billigan Bushes Chin, Kiani Dashte, the Billigan Dashanella, Bidahashi, Dan Nasha.
Yat A. Shea Chishan, Shlento, Bimpa 20 Bushes Chin, not also Dashache, dot Lezatlana Dashanella, Zetan Sade Nasha. Why we're here today? We came with a delegation of people from Arizona. There's about 11 of us all together, and we come from a land that is heavily resource rich, and we came to tell the world that we're not going to be a resource colony anymore, and enough is enough.
The Navajo Nation, Diné Nation, which we're from, sits on the richest energy corridor in North America. So our people for close to a century have been at the front line of energy extraction for this empire, including natural gas, oil, uranium, and coal. And now they're taking the water and pumping the water. Meanwhile, our people, a third of our people don't have access to running water. I live without running water with my family. And so we're here to say, we're still here, and no more native sacrifice for this empire.
The people, united, will never be defeated. This is the banner that was carried at the People's Climate March on Sunday. It reads simply, Flood Wall Street. As hundreds unfurl it and hold it over their heads, right in the heart of Wall Street.
My name is Laurel Sutherland. We've just deployed a 300-foot banner right next to the iconic bull in downtown Manhattan. And today, 125 heads of state from around the world are arriving in New York City. And we're here to tell the people of the world that we stand with them, and we're willing to take radical action to bring about the drastic changes that are needed to have a healthy and livable future for our children.
Hi, I'm a former state senator from Vermont. My name is Ben Potashnik, and I've been in the solar business now for about 10 years in Mexico. I went to pioneer the solar energy industry because of global climate change. But now I felt I had to come back because the U.S. Congress is borne out by the Koch brothers, the deniers, the Tea Party, and we've got to do something. We got to do it here on Wall Street.
Hi, I'm Dr. Laura Chamberlain. I'm with Frack Free Illinois, and we are here to protest fracking. In Illinois, they're fracking right in the most active earthquake zones east of the Rockies. The largest earthquake in the U.S. ever that we know of was right here in the New Madrid Fault, and they're going right to this area in Illinois. They're completely ignoring, even the USGS Hazards Division has said it's probably not a good idea to frack right here. There's so much air pollution and respiratory effects of climate change from all of the different, the burning of fossil fuels. So for fracking itself, the air pollution is volatile organic compounds like benzene. They create ozone, and some of the places that they're fracking in Utah, the air is worse worse in rural Utah than it is in LA. This is crazy.
I'm Catherine Ball. I'm from Detroit, Michigan.
Hi, I'm Arthur van Balen from Berlin, Germany. And we're from the group Tools for Actions, and we make inflatables for actions and protests together with other groups.
And what we did here was we made a 15-foot sphere that was representing or symbolizing the carbon bubble, which is an economic bubble.
So the carbon bubble is similar like the housing bubble. It's about the shares of the fossil fuel industry and that they're overvalued and that the bubble will burst because it's based on unburnable carbon.
What happened to the actual physical carbon bubble here?
Yes, so the carbon bubble was inflated with air, and it was kind of like a giant black and silver beach ball, and it got pushed over the crowd here at Flood Wall Street, and then it went and knocked off the bull, and then the police stabbed it and ripped it apart and tore the air out. So in a way, they engaged with the analogy and popped the carbon bubble.
How do you feel about losing your bubble?
This is totally fine. This is like a symbolic act, and the guardians of the state performed the popping of the bubble for us, so we are fine with this.
Actually, it was our intention. It's like part of the performance to get them to engage with the analogy and engage with the symbolism in a tangible way.
Did you rehearse with them beforehand?
We didn't. Well, I guess we're always kind of rehearsing with the cops.
The whole world is watching! The whole world is watching!
There are a bunch of police here. They're arresting someone. They've got him on the ground. Hey, what's your name? What's your name?
What's your name?
This is Democracy Now! What's your name?
My name is Elliot Hughes. I was tortured in 2008 at the RNC and Republican National Convention in St. Paul. They might do it to me again. Help me. Help me. Fighting for environmental justice and worker control and the total dismantlement of capitalism.
A young man was just arrested who was standing on top of two phone booths as the police took him down. Not clear why they were arresting him. They had him down on the ground. We asked him his name, said it was Elliot Hughes, and he said he was tortured at the RNC in 2008 at the Republican convention. The police brought him down on the ground, and they have taken him out. We didn't follow beyond the barriers because we're covering the Flood Wall Street demonstration, and we're afraid if we leave the barriers, we won't be allowed to get back in. There are hundreds of people, more than 1,000 people who have gathered here on Wall Street to protest Wall Street, to flood Wall Street on the second day of climate action in New York.
Your name and what you're doing here.
Yeah, my name is Graham Klumner. I'm an Afghanistan war veteran. I'm here to talk about climate change and the connections with militarism.
What is that connection?
Well, I mean, when we go overseas, we're going for resources and political social influence, and that comes down to oil. It comes down to the things that are in the ground that we're digging up and burning, go in the atmosphere, and eventually are putting us in a position where we don't have a future for our children, and the next veterans generation is going to be climate veterans. So as a veteran of the last wars, I want to stop the next ones. Part of this is a paradigm shift. Historically, social movements need to have a coming out and awakening moment, and this is it for the climate movement. This has been going on for 25 years. We've known the truth for over 100, and this is the time where we come out to the world and say, we've had enough of this. We need your help. This is about love. This is about the 99 versus the 1%, and Wall Street are the people profiting off of these wars. Today's the day where we turn the tide.
I'm Beth Henry from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm not with a group. I just came from Charlotte with my good friend Pat Moore. We're worried about our children and grandchildren in the future. We want Wall Street to stop funding climate chaos and fund only the solutions to climate change.
You are a big activist taking on Duke Energy. Explain for people outside of the region in North Carolina the significance of Duke Energy.
Duke Energy is the largest electric utility in the country, and they burn a lot of coal. So in North Carolina, we're trying to get Duke Energy to make a rapid transition to renewable energy in hopes that their leadership will cause other utilities to make a rapid change as well.
My name is Lee Stewart from Aldie, Virginia. I started the march in LA. We're marching from LA to DC.
The march?
Yeah, the Great March for Climate Action. It's not the People's Climate March, but we've come here. We've paused our march for 4 days to come to New York City.
How many days have you been marching?
We have been marching since March 1st and will finish in Washington, D.C. on November 1st.
And 200 days you've been walking across the country. Why?
I have been walking to confront my own inaction and my own complicity in the system.
We are Idle No More group created a series of healing walks. Led by Indigenous elders. Along the 5 refineries. That exist in the Bay Area. They need to transition.
My name is Penny Opal Plant. I'm with Idle No More San Francisco Bay, and I am here rising up for the future of life on Mother Earth's belly because the corporate capitalist state is so ignorant and arrogant that they will ruin the Mother Earth's creation. And that's why I'm here. We all have to stand up in every corner of the world, no matter where we are, no matter who we are. If you love your children, if you love your garden, if you love to breathe air and drink water and eat food, then you need to hit the streets.
My name is Tim DeChristopher. And you all look beautiful. When we talk about climate justice, it means keeping fossil fuels in the ground. And doing so in a way that does not guarantee profits. To those who have already profited from exploitation. That means costing trillions in profits. To the wealthiest and most ruthless industry. In the history of the world. And they will not change easily. They will not change just because we ask. They will change only because we force them. Mic check. We are staying here. We will not move. We will not be moved. Because we are sitting. For justice. Because there is only one future. We are it. So we stay here. Till the closing bell. And beyond. Pizzas are on the way.
Sheila Reck-Schaefer.
Judy Maruffi.
And we marched against the war. We marched for civil rights. We marched in the 70s, and we are so excited to see young people back into the battle to get the things we need. And we did it, and you guys can do it.
We must remember. We are not separate. From the sacred circle of life. On Mother Earth's belly. We must be humble. And remember. We are simple human beings. Fighting for not only ourselves. But the rest of the circle of life that she has created.
Like water, gonna calm this crisis down. The voice of my great-granddaughter saying shut down Wall Street now. The people on the rise like the water. We're gonna run this crisis down.
The voices of Flood Wall Street. More than 1,000 people gathered on Wall Street on Monday following the largest climate demonstration in history. Over 400,000 people marched on Sunday. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. Special thanks to Hani. When we come back, leaders from around the world talking on this day of the UN Climate Summit. Stay with us.
With a drum, a song, a prayer, this change of time. This is the true reckoning, the human awakening. Together, brothers and sisters, I don't know more. Together, brothers and sisters, I don't know more. Oh, hey, oh, hey, wait, hey, oh, wait, oh, wait, oh.
Eulalie here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Mate.
Well, 2 days after the historic People's Climate March, world leaders are gathering in New York today for a UN summit on climate change. President Obama and over 100 other heads of state are expected to attend, but the leaders of several major polluters, including China, India, and Canada, are skipping the talks. The summit is part of a lengthy and so far failed process heading into climate negotiations in Paris next year, when countries will seek a binding deal to limit the emissions that cause global warming.
We're joined right now by three guests. Vandana Shiva is the executive director of the Navdanya Trust in India, which promotes biodiversity conservation, organic farming, the rights of farmers, and the process of seed saving. Author of many books, including Making Peace with the Earth and Soil, Not Oil, Environmental Justice in an Age of Climate Crisis. Desmond Dasa is with us. He's coordinator of the South Durban Community Environmental Alliance in South Africa, the recipient of the 2014 Goldman Environmental Prize. And Winona LaDuke is also here, Native American activist and executive director of the group Honor the Earth. She lives and works on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, author of several books, including most recently The Militarization of Indian Country. And she has just finished a 200-mile horseback ride. Winona, let's start with you. Tell us about this horseback ride.
I live near Lake Superior, and it turns out that the object of some oil companies' affections is the most inland port, Duluth and Superior area, which is how they can get oil out. We rode along what's known as the Sandpiper, which is a fracked oil pipeline out of North Dakota. They are trying to put in through the heartland of Anishinaabe territory, through our best wild rice lakes, and through the land of lakes in the north. And so we took to our horses, and we rode for about 200 miles on that, and prayed, and just to draw attention to it, but also to put down our prayers and to say that this is not a good pipeline. A lot of people know about those other pipelines, like the Keystone XL, but there's a whole number of pipelines headed towards Superior right now. The proposal is about 4 million barrels a day of oil to be heading towards Superior, and we don't want to see that.
And isn't a whole lot of oil already heading through your land? What has been the impact so far?
We've had some spills. I mean, the corporation we're dealing with is the Enbridge Corporation. 800 spills in the past decade.
Enbridge is based where?
Enbridge is based out of Calgary, another Canadian corporation that believes it has rights to private property in the United States. In this case, our feeling is that what we believe is that we love water more than we love oil. And in Minnesota, I think that is the case, because we have 10,000 lakes and you can drink the water where we live. That's really worth fighting for.
And how do the pipelines affect the land? Are they above ground? Are they underground? How does it work?
A little bit of both. And the problem is that I'm probably a little like you. I'm not opposed to infrastructure. Like, infrastructure is a good thing in a first world country. Pipelines are not my problem. The problem is dirty oil pipelines. Fracked oil, things that blow up with 600 different chemicals on it, highly volatile pipelines, or tar sands pipelines. Those things. And they are both above ground and below ground. The fact is that there's only 130 or so pipeline inspectors in this country from PIMSA, and I'm really not sure how they're going to keep track of all those pipelines because they don't have a good record so far. In our territory, a minute of a spill of the Sandpiper line, the proposed Enbridge route, 1 minute spill, 20,000 gallons. That will not get out of our ecosystem. This is an entirely biodiverse, largely aquatic ecosystem in northern Minnesota. And once you get oil in that, you are not cleaning it up.
Desmond Dessa, the UN Climate Summit is happening here today at the United Nations. Among those speaking will be President Obama. You are here for the climate march, but you're not going today. You've come in from South Africa.
Certainly, you know, we've had 3 climate summits and we've had 19 of the conference of the polluters. The UNFFC for 19 solid years, and what has that brought about? Now, we certainly believe in South Africa that the change has to come from the outside, that we don't trust our leaders, neither do we trust the corporations that are lobbying extensively inside with our governments. And their main concern is their profit margin. Our main concern is life and death on the outside, and that's why I believe that they're organizing and mobilizing people all over the world. And this has been an awesome and a huge week for ordinary people all over the world, because not only has New York come to a standstill with over 400,000 people, but also all over the world there's been 25,000 activities, which has given us a huge lift, but also an enormous hope for the future.
Desmond, you're here from Durban, South Africa. You've been involved in struggles there since you were a teenager. South Durban is known as Cancer Alley to some people. Can you talk about the struggles that you're involved in right now?
The major struggle at the present moment is the expansion of the Durban port with its related petrochemical pipelines, terminals, the oil exploration. All the major oil corporations, ExxonMobil, including Shell and BP, who have major leaks and episodes and incidents that have occurred in the U.S. are rushing to the Indian Ocean and cutting up the Indian Ocean, and the full authority of our government, you know, to cut up the Indian Ocean and to do seismic testing. The obvious reason is to look for oil, to find the oil, and they wouldn't be investing a whole lot of money if they didn't know there was no oil in the Indian Ocean. What it does for us as people in South Africa is that the seismic testing or oil exploration does not create any jobs. It's going to destroy livelihoods of predominantly peasant fishermen. Thousands of them that live in our communities in Durban and in South Africa and all along the Indian Ocean. They will lose their livelihoods, as it is South Africa suffering from 50% of unemployment, particularly on black youth in the country. And so these oil explorations and all this expansion programs are not geared to create jobs. That's our major concern, and this will be the biggest displacement of poor black people, pro-90. Last seen during the apartheid era in the 80s, 70s and 80s, when the Separation Acts came into place in South Africa that separated people of color, where poor black people were displaced and placed along the dirty industry, knowing fully well that the impact of the dirty industry will be kept secret for years. It's only through sheer efforts by people, ordinary people and communities, that we got to know about the chemicals and the impact it had on our health. That, with the expansion of the port and the expansion of the oil exploration, the expansion of the oil terminals and the oil storage facilities in Durban, it is the biggest already, but that will even triple the amount of petroleum products produced in South Africa, also brought into South Africa from other parts of the world, and that will have a devastating impact in a community already suffering from 50% of chronic asthma, high levels of cancer and high levels of leukemia that we bury our people every week.
Talk about the effects, Vandana Shiva, of climate change on your country, India. Not only talk about climate change, but the focus of yesterday's protest on Wall Street, also a large theme in Sunday's massive protest, was the effect of corporations on climate change.
Climate change is quite very clearly an externality of not just a fossil fuel industry, but a corporate-driven industry which has dismantled our processes of people's rights, democratic rights, and the cultures that have protected our ecosystems. I come from the land of the Himalaya, the central part where the Ganges starts. That's where I was born, that's where I've grown up. Last year, we had floods we've never seen, rainfall 350% more, extreme events in 2 days, glaciers melting, hydroelectric projects adding to the devastation, 20,000 people dead. Right now, the Jhelum River has flooded in Kashmir, more than 500 people washed away. In 2010, the desert, high-altitude desert of Ladakh, which has no rain, had rain so extreme that 200 people were washed away in the valley of Leh, and 10,000 in Pakistan downstream. 1999, a super cyclone in Orissa doubled the velocity of any average historic cyclone. Most historic cyclones stopped close to the coast. This went 3 miles inland, causing so much devastation that more than 30,000 people were killed. So we are talking about climate devastation already killing people and destroying ecosystems. My book, Soil Not Oil, shows that 40% of the greenhouse gases are coming from a corporate-driven agriculture, substituting the ecological processes of regenerating the soil with chemical fertilizers, small farms and peasant farming and peasant fishing with fossil fuel-driven systems using 300, 400 energy slaves behind every human being, and then factory farming, the waste of food, and the whole emissions of methane. In ecological agriculture in the hands of people, not only do we have 100% solution to get these emissions out of the atmosphere, as our work in Navdanya shows, we are able to double food production, a 200% increase. We're able to generate employment because small farms produce 70% of the food eaten by people. And if we defend small farms of today and increase them, we solve the problem of unemployment. Every major problem of our time, including health. We have a cancer train leaving Punjab, which is the land of the Green Revolution, and they talk of Norman Borlaug, who pushed the Green Revolution on India for the multinationals, the industry that had sold chemicals during the war, then basically re-engineered them as agri-chemicals. Articles come out about him being a saint and him selling miracles and the 12 people he trained being apostles of wheat. That's where things have gone wrong. They've forgotten that science is supposed to be about science. And today that cancer train from Punjab is a result of the chemicals that came from the war into agriculture and into our food systems and our bodies. There is a continuum between wars we see as wars, like what's happening in Syria right now, but also the wars against the planet and the wars against people. Corporations are behind all of this. And I see, as Wall Street makes the world's economies collapse, the only economy left is war.
There was an interesting sign at Flood Wall Street yesterday, Winona. It said, "Tear down that Wall Street," referring, of course, to Reagan's famous line about the Berlin Wall. But you are going to be at the UN Climate Summit today, Winona. Where will you be? Why are you going?
I'm going to be with the indigenous people. It's a really historic time for us. I mean, the fact is that, you know, I was at the first UN conference on indigenous people in 1977, and yesterday the Tadadaho was at the General Assembly, and then today there will be indigenous people addressing. And I think that just those moments that indigenous people as part of our work, you know, being there is important. I'm going to be at the climate summit that is on the side, you know, with indigenous people. But it is an important time for indigenous people. We have no recourse in the United States or in Canada and many of these countries under our law. That's why we've been fighting for some international recognition of our rights as peoples, as indigenous peoples. But, you know, these issues are very systemic. They affect all kinds of people, the issues of climate change and, you know, climate disaster. That is across the board. We're going to continue this discussion right after the show, and we're going to post it online at democracynow.org. Winona LaDuke, I want to thank you for being with us. Native American leader, writer. Desmond Asa, thank you so much for joining us. South African environmentalist based in Durban, winner of the 2014 Goldman Prize, and Vandana Shiva, Indian environmental leader, feminist, and author. That does it for the broadcast. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Mate. Our website is democracynow.org. Special thanks to Mike Burke, Renee Pels, Aaron Mate, Nermeen Sheikh, Dina Guzder, Steve Martinez, Sam Alkoff. Thanks for joining us.